Well, especially once we have reached a certain age, we'll often look back and see that the way that our lives have worked out contains a fair amount of mystery. Some parts of our personal story are straightforward, aren't they? Times when we took a fairly obviously good decision and things worked out well. Or there might be times when we took a fairly obviously bad decision and things turned out terribly. But we also know that life is more complex than that, don't we? There will be times in our lives, I'm sure it's true for you, it's true for me, I think, when we've done something in completely good faith and it's turned out terribly, disastrously. But reassuringly, the very opposite can happen as well. In all of our lives, I suggest, there will be times when we've taken a wrong turn and things have turned out badly for quite a while, perhaps, only for those same events, mysteriously and strangely, to then lead us on to something really good. Something good occurring that wouldn't have happened otherwise. It happens quite a lot, and I'm not just talking about sort of moral failures. I failed geography O-level, which at the time seemed a little bit of a disaster because I was planning to do it for A-level. Not really for very good reasons. The geography teacher directed the musicals that we did at school, and I felt that, if I stayed in with him, I'd continue to get leading roles. But that failure of geography O-level led to me having to think of another A-level to do. And my decision to do religious studies, which I'd never really shown much interest in before, pretty much set me on the path to where I am now. And I guess, when I think about it, what makes me a Christian more than anything else is seeing again and again throughout my life the way in which God redeems things that have gone wrong in people's lives. God uses those very things that often have gone wrong in people's lives to then lead them onto things that are new and unexpected. Not normally by God scrapping the consequences of our failures, our mistakes, but usually by God using that very failure to then lead us onto something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And that is basically what we see in the Bible again and again. And we particularly see it in the place of the people of Israel in God's big plan. Last week with Tim, we asked the question of why God chose Israel. And the basic answer is that Israel was chosen to be a key part of God's plan for rescuing the world. See, right from the start of creation, long before the call of Israel, God called human beings in general to carry responsibility for the world. Those stories in Genesis, which, as I said a couple of weeks ago, I believe are stories to help us understand reality more, those stories make that very clear. That's why Genesis 1 describes human beings as being made in God's image. Why were human beings made in God's image? Because we were meant to represent God's rule over the world. Human beings were created so we could rule the world and care for it on God's behalf. But fairly soon, according to these early stories in the Bible, all of that went wrong, didn't it? With the very human beings that God created to care for the world disobeying him, with the result that the world got in a complete mess. But here is the really extraordinary thing. Regardless of the mess that human beings had made of their calling, caring for the world, God in the Bible never gives up on that original plan of bringing about his purpose for the world through human beings. God never scraps plan A and devises a plan B instead. God instead sticks to plan A, which is revealed in the process to be a lot more mysterious than anyone had realized. That is crucial, I believe, for understanding what the Bible is all about. And I'll repeat that line. God never scraps plan A and goes for a plan B instead. God instead sticks to plan A, which is revealed in the process to be a lot more mysterious than anyone had hitherto realized. And that mystery really centers on the way in which God uses the failure of Israel. Not just the failure of Israel, the failure of its forefathers, its patriarchs. Think of those stories early on in the Bible of people like Abraham, people like Jacob, people like Joseph. None of them are perfect, far from it, are they? They're all deeply flawed. They're people who sometimes did things that were absolutely terrible. But that reinforces the point that God, maybe bizarrely, maybe strangely from our point of view, God committed himself to working through, not despite, through a flawed and sinful people as part of his big plan. As part of his big plan for dealing with the world and its sin and restoring it. And that pattern that we see start with figures like these patriarchs, it continues with the people of Israel. God rescued the people of Israel in the biggest episode in the whole of the Old Testament, didn't he? The Exodus, or the escape from Egypt. And then, crucially, he gives Israel the law. We heard a lot about the law in that passage that John read to us earlier. God gives his law through Moses. And in the process of all of that, the rescue of Israel and then giving Israel the law, God, according to Exodus 19, which is a really important passage, it's just before they received the Ten Commandments, God declares that Israel would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's the calling that God gives to Israel, to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, the most obvious sense of this is of a people being given a special revelation of God so that they can be an example to the rest of the world. An example of the goodness and the blessing that comes from living under God and his rule. And we can understand that idea of a good example, can't we? We can understand the idea of Israel being a living symbol to the other nations of the reality of God, the idea of the non-Israelite nations being able to look over to Israel and see what living under God looked like, and therefore to grasp the goodness of God and be attracted to worship him themselves. That idea makes complete sense, doesn't it? The trouble is that it didn't turn out that way. If that was the plan, it dismally failed, didn't it? Israel turned out, by and large, to be the very opposite of a good example of what it looked like to live under God's rule. Pretty much as soon as she'd left Egypt and received those 10 commandments, actually while Moses was receiving those commandments, Israel was disobedient to God in the most spectacular way possible. And that continued during the time in the wilderness that followed. Israel constantly grumbles, constantly disobeys God, is the opposite of an obedient people. And later on, they do enter the promised land under Moses' successor Joshua, but Israel's disobedience and its sin continues. And constant disaster happens as a result, the opposite of blessing. God continues to rescue the people of Israel. He continues to show grace towards them. But Israel continues to get worse and worse and worse. And it really reaches its nadir, its depth, with the book of Judges. And even the rescuers that God sends by this stage, people like Jephthah and Samson, are totally flawed as well. And if even the rescuers that God sends are totally depraved, it really shows that Israel is getting worse and worse and worse. Now, the answer for a time appears to be God's establishment of a monarchy, and particularly the coming of King David, who's meant to be a man after God's own heart. And God makes David the most amazing and seemingly unconditional promises about his dynasty reigning forever and being eternal. But after a promising start, David also shows that he's just as flawed as the people of Israel. And there's one particular episode that is particularly crucial here. One of David's followers is a Gentile or a non-Jew called Uriah the Hittite. And he's just the sort of person that Israel, as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, were meant to be drawing closer to God. And Uriah, whose name means the Lord is my light, Uriah is utterly faithful to David. But David has sex with Uriah's wife Bathsheba, and when she becomes pregnant and the child can't be passed off as Uriah's, David has him murdered. And when the prophet Nathan rebukes David the words that he says to David are really significant. Here they are. Nathan, the prophet, not the youth worker at Christ Church, says to David these words, and they're really crucial. Because by doing this, you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt, the son born to you will die. David had been promised his dynasty will be eternal, that his son and then the son of that son would reign forever and so on. So it's bringing that into a certain amount of question. But the crucial bit's the first bit. They're meant to be a light to the other nations. But what David has done, ruthlessly disposing of this faithful Gentile follower, has been to make the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt. What he's done is bad enough, but what he's done in terms of Israel's calling and completely abandoning that takes it to another scale. And David is also told this by Nathan as well. He's told the sword will never depart from your house. And from that point on, from this terrible sin that David commits and this terrible failing of the calling of Israel's king, the man after God's own heart, supposedly, from this point on, we see Israel disintegrating more and more and more until hundreds of years, several hundred years later, after countless further disasters, Israel is taken away from the land that God had promised her and taken into exile. So, the question, what is this all about? Was God's plan really about Israel being a perfect example to the world? Because if it was a pretty naive, a pretty disastrous plan, wasn't it? The answer is no. And what was really going on with God's call of Israel turning out to be a lot more mysterious, with the very failure of Israel factored in. And as I said earlier, it's St. Paul who really gives the clearest exposition of this in his letter to the Romans. Now, Romans is 16 chapters long. It is a long letter. In places, it's really complex. But that's because its whole point is to try and explain to us some of the mystery within God's big plan. St. Paul, when he writes to the Christians at Rome, and they're composed of both Jewish and Gentile Christians, Paul engages with the idea that Israel was meant to be that perfect example to the world of what it meant to live under God's rule. But then he ruthlessly exposes Israel's failure in this regard. And one of the most damning statements that Paul makes in Romans is when he quotes the Old Testament to say this of Israel. It's rather similar to how Nathan rebuked David. As it is written, Paul says, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. In other words, because of the way Israel acted, the other nations think God is a joke. They've done the very opposite of their calling. And from this point on in Romans, that's early on in chapter 2, Paul then has to explain how God's plan was able to go forward. How was God's plan possibly able to go forward when the very people who were chosen to be part of the solution turned out to be so spectacularly part of the problem? What is the answer? Paul sets up this massive problem, and you think, well, what on earth is the answer? And the answer that Paul comes up with is that Israel's failure was factored in. Israel's failure was all part, mysteriously, of God's solution. Romans is complex, particularly when it comes to Paul's explanation of the role of the Jewish law. That passage that John read to us earlier is complex. But in a number of places, what Paul says is that, strange though it may seem, the law that God gave to Moses, while being holy and good, was actually given, believe it or not, to increase Israel's sin. That, according to Paul, is the reason why God gave the law, so that Israel's sin would actually, for some strange reason, increase rather than decrease. There are some of the references. It does seem completely bizarre, doesn't it? And that's why a lot of people have thought, well, it may be saying that, but it can't really be meaning that. But that's what it says. And actually, Jesus said something very similar when he quoted the prophet Isaiah to explain why he taught in parables. Jesus said that he taught in parables not to make it easier for the people of Israel to understand God's message, but actually the very opposite. He quotes the prophet Isaiah to say that he spoke in parables to keep Israel unable to see and hear, and therefore respond to God. Here are those words. Next slide. That's what Jesus says. He quotes Isaiah to explain why he taught in parables, so that you'll be ever hearing but never understanding, ever seeing but never perceiving. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, turn, and I would heal them. Really bizarre, really strange. You'd imagine that's exactly what God, through Jesus, would want to happen. They're incredible words. Why on earth would God do these things? And particularly, why would God do this to his chosen people? It doesn't seem to make any sense at all. Unless, that is, Israel was always intended to be part of the plan by which sin would be carried by the human beings that God had commissioned to rule the world and therefore dealt with. It starts to make sense when we think of these chosen people being part of the atonement process, the process by which the world's sin will be dealt with. This, I believe, is the explanation of how Israel fulfilled her calling to be a kingdom of priests. And the crucial piece in the jigsaw, Paul says in Romans, is recognizing that Jesus comes as Israel's Messiah to be the surprising resolution to all of this. Because Jesus is the one who comes to fulfill that calling on Israel's behalf by carrying all of that sin that had amassed within Israel within his body, because he comes to be Israel's Messiah. Israel's very failure, in other words, is a vital part of this process. God's mysterious plan was somehow to draw the sin of the world to a height within Israel, and giving Israel the law was part of this process because it really made them worse. And it draws the sin of the world somehow to a height within Israel. Why? So that it could be passed on to Israel's Messiah and dealt with when he died. That, I believe, is the meaning of that strange passage from Romans 7 that was read to us. Paul isn't, I believe, talking autobiographically in that passage. He's talking about Israel's plight under the law, desperately wanting to obey God's law, delighting within it, but not being able to implement or to do that law because of sin. And that holy and good law that Israel had been given by God, therefore resulting in death for them. Paul uses I throughout that passage, I believe, because he wants to show the Gentile Christians how attached he is to his fellow Jews. And he wants them to feel a similar commitment towards them. That's why Paul also describes Israel later in Romans 9 as a vessel of wrath. And it's why the whole purpose of Paul's letter to the Romans is to tell the Gentile Christians, people like us, people who had flooded into the church after Jesus' death and resurrection, that they should be utterly grateful to the Jews for their unwitting but nevertheless crucial and sacrificial role in God's big plan. God's big plan, which would ultimately see all of God's people, Jews and Gentiles together, brought into one great family. Well, you might be thinking, jolly interesting, Vicar, perhaps not, but what's it got to do with us? What has any of this history got to do with us? Well, there is, to be honest, a uniqueness about all of this that means, in part, it is simply a case of learning about the amazing mystery within God's big plan. The application, as I say, that Paul is working to in Romans, and his reason for explaining all of this mystery within God's covenant plan is, as I say, to exhort the Gentile Christians in Rome to love their Jewish brothers and sisters and be utterly grateful for the role that they had played, albeit unwittingly, in enabling them to come to God. There was already at that stage in the church the tendency towards an anti-Semitism, the tendency for Christians to despise the Jews, God's original covenant people, and to see them as replaced. And Paul wants Christians to have nothing to do with that. He wants Christians to be utterly grateful to the people who had preserved the faith that they'd inherited and also played a crucial role in them being able to come to God. And that application is still relevant to us today. The application for Gentile Christians, and I think most of us here are Gentile Christians. Funnily, David Loffman, who we'll be praying for in our prayers, who's just had an operation this week. David is a Jewish Christian, but we haven't got so many of them here at Christchurch. Most of us are Gentile Christians. And there is still a vital application for us, not least with the rise of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness is sadly on the rise within the world today. It's not fading away. And Christians are meant to have nothing whatsoever to do with anti-Semitism. And very often, Christianity has aided and abetted anti-Semitism. A lot of the horrific things that happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s sadly had a lot of roots in horrific Christian attitudes towards Jews that had happened earlier in history, in European history. Now, that doesn't mean us taking an uncritical response to the actions of the state of Israel. Certainly doesn't mean us seeing the Palestinian people as having less rights than the Israelis. Both of those, I think, would be a major mistake. But it does mean Gentile Christians recognizing that the Jewish people have played a crucial, if deeply mysterious role in us being able to find God's grace and enter his people. We're rightly grateful to Jesus, aren't we? And we remember that regularly in our worship, for the suffering and death that Jesus endured so that we could be forgiven and brought into God's people. But part of what Paul is saying in Romans is that alongside that, we also need to have a tremendous gratitude as well to the people of Israel for their crucial role, the crucial role that paradoxically their failure had in preparing the way for God's way of dealing with the world's sin through Jesus. Once we're clear about that, and I believe that is Paul's primary intention in what he talks about in Romans, once we're clear about that, we can, I believe, legitimately extend this application as well. And this takes us back to where I started this morning. The truth is that God works out his plan for all of our lives in a deeply mysterious way. All of us here will have gone through things in our lives that have deeply perplexed us. All of us here would have experienced hardship, sometimes due to things done to us, sometimes due to our own mistakes. All of us here will have failed. There will be times we look back and think, I just so wish I hadn't taken that step, with the consequences that came from it. And all of us will, I think, at points look at our lives and think, what on earth is God up to? Now, some of you will be going through situations like that right now. And the temptation, the very understandable temptation, is to think that God is either indifferent to our suffering or he's incompetent, that he wants to do the right thing and he's just not very good at doing it. And those feelings, as I say, are completely understandable when we're in the middle of things in our lives that have worked out seemingly so badly, with seemingly no possibility of redemption. But a third possibility, and this is where faith really comes in, a third possibility is that God really does know what he's doing. And the failure, the disaster, and the hardship that we have endured, and perhaps are still enduring, is all part of a mysterious plan. A mysterious plan that God has for further revealing his love. Now, it's often when we've come out to the other side of something and we can look back that we can see this. When we're in the middle of it, by definition, we can't. And it calls for faith. It calls for a faith in the God of the Bible, who again and again we see being able to redeem the most disastrous and awful situations. Israel failing again and again and again, and God not just cutting Israel off and saying, okay, you've got to stew in your own juice. Sometimes it looks like that happening, and sometimes to some degree that does happen, but God is a God of redemption and is always working to find a way back. One of the illustrations I've used of this over the years is that of a sat-nav. When you've got the sat-nav in your car telling you the direction to take, and you decide to take your own turning or perhaps take it by mistake, what happens with the sat-nav? Well, it goes quiet for a little while, doesn't it? And then it comes up with a suggestion for going forward. It doesn't just say, right, you've disobeyed me, over to you, stuff it. It would be quite fun in some ways if a sat-nav did that and say, well, if you're not going to listen to me, then I'm not going to bother to tell you anything. But the sat-nav's not like an irascible partner. The sat-nav goes quiet for a while and then comes up with something, with the difference to God being that the sat-nav is making a plan B or a plan C or a plan D. With God, it's that God's plan A turns out to be a lot more mysterious than we had ever realised. And particularly if you are in the middle, or perhaps in a long-term situation where hardship and disaster and the consequences of things that have happened in the past are still with you and still cause you pain, I hope it can be some sort of encouragement to keep faith in this God who, perhaps inexplicably, continues with his big plan he has always had of working through deeply flawed and broken human beings. God, as I say, doesn't work out his plan despite broken and failing human beings. They are intrinsic to that plan. Our very brokenness, our very failure, our very weakness. Paul, in another of his letters in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians, makes it clear that God can only work through people who are broken and are failures. It talks about him showing his treasure in jars of clay, and the jars of clay is referring to us. So I hope, as we think about this mystery in the way that God uses the failure of Israel, I hope that it can be an encouragement to us to realise that he can use us as well in all of the failures and disasters in our lives as part of his big plan of bringing about his purposes for the world.